She was just a young black girl carrying a pink suitcase and dreams too big for that narrow aisle. No louder than a whisper, no more demanding than a smile. So why did a flight attendant roll her eyes and sneer at her like she didn't belong? And why, when her hand trembled as she placed the bag in the overhead bin, did strangers around her pretend not to see what no one on that plane realized was who was watching? Not from the front, not from behind the curtain, but from row 4C, a man with calm eyes, a man with power, and a secret. What happens when prejudice shows its face mid-air just before it's about to meet its reckoning? How does a simple moment, a girl's quiet humiliation, trigger a storm that grounds an airline? This is not just a story about travel, it's about truth, about justice wrapped in silence, and about love hidden in plain sight. You won't want to miss a second of what happens next. If this already tugged at your heart, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin the story. The airport was buzzing with the usual rhythm of a busy Friday afternoon. Families huddled around kiosks, business travelers clutched briefcases and boarding passes, and the ever-familiar voice over the loudspeaker echoed with delays and gate changes. Amid the swirl of movement stood a young girl named Everett Rose. Alani, just 15, clutched a sleek, deep purple carry-on with delicate floral embroidery along one edge. It wasn't a designer label, but it was hers. Her father had it custom made, not because they couldn't afford more popular brands, but because he believed in creating something that told a story. The bag had her initials stitched under the handle in a cursive script A.M.R. Next to her stood her mother, Nadine Rose, dressed in soft cream slacks and a navy blouse. Nadine's expression held that gentle alertness mothers carry when navigating airports with their children. Behind them trailed a neatly dressed young woman pushing a stroller, nodding politely as she followed the line toward the first-class counter. But for Alani, something felt off. Someone was watching her. That someone was a flight attendant standing across the lobby, arms crossed and mouth curled in a smirk. Her name tag read Ms. Baxter. She was tall, in her early 40s, with blonde hair slicked tightly into a bun and a walk that suggested command. She whispered something to a gate agent beside her. Both of them laughed. Alani looked down at her bag. She hadn't imagined it. "Mom," she whispered, leaning closer. "Did you see that lady staring at me?" Nadine glanced up just as Ms. Baxter turned and started toward them. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Is this your bag?" Ms. Baxter asked, her tone light but with an undercurrent of something sharp. Alani nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Ms. Baxter let out a quiet chuckle, loud enough to draw glances from people nearby. "Well, aren't you bold, bringing something like that into first class?" Alani blinked. "I don't understand." Ms. Baxter tapped the handle. This looks like something from a street market. First-class passengers typically carry higher-end luggage. You're in the wrong line, sweetheart. Economy's that way." Nadine stepped forward, placing a protective arm in front of her daughter. "We are in the correct line. Our tickets are for first class." The agent at the counter looked up, uncertainty flashing across her face. Ms. Baxter turned to her with a smile that warned her not to intervene. Then she returned her gaze to Alani and said, "Softer this time. I've been with this airline for 19 years. I know who belongs where." Alani's stomach tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but her throat felt heavy, like her words would sink before they reached her mouth. The other passengers in line had gone quiet. Some looked away, others stared, curious or unsure whether to step in. Silence, thick and stinging, wrapped around Alani's shoulders. She remembered her father's words when he gave her the bag. "You'll carry your story with you, even when the world tries to shrink you. Let it speak louder than their whispers." But it was hard to remember those words now, standing under the weight of mockery. Nadine's voice cut through the moment, calm, controlled. "We'd like to continue with our check-in. You've made your point." Before Ms. Baxter could respond, a deep voice interrupted from behind. "Is there a problem here?" A tall man in his mid-40s stepped forward. He wore a navy jacket over a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled up. His presence was quiet, but commanding, like someone who didn't need to raise his voice to shift a room's energy. His name was Everett Rose. Alani turned. Relief spread across her face. "Dad." Everett's eyes moved between the flight attendant, the check-in agent, and his daughter. His gaze landed last on the embroidered bag. He recognized it instantly, not just because he had commissioned it for her, but because it held the same pattern from the wallpaper in her childhood bedroom. It was more than luggage. It was a memory stitched into fabric. "Ms." Baxter's mouth twitched. "I was just letting the young lady know that the first-class line is over here." "She knows," Everett said. His voice was even, but there was steel behind it. "She's exactly where she belongs." Something about the way he said it made the agent behind the desk straighten in her seat. Nadine reached out and gently placed a hand on her husband's arm. She felt the tension in him, the quiet rage boiling just beneath his composed expression. Everett stepped closer. "I'm Everett Rose. I'd appreciate it if you stopped policing my daughter's choice in bags and focused on your actual responsibilities." A hush settled around the counter. The gate agent typed hurriedly and handed over 3 boarding passes. "Your seats are ready, Mr. Rose. Pre-boarding begins in 20 minutes. Ms. Baxter glanced between them, suddenly wary. She looked as if she wanted to say something, but decided not to. As the family walked toward security, Alani held tight to her bag. "Are you okay?" Everett asked quietly once they were away from the crowd. Alani hesitated. "I wanted to say something, but I couldn't. I didn't want to cry in front of her." "You don't have to fight every battle in the moment," Everett said, "but you never have to shrink for anyone. You hear me? Not for uniforms, not for looks, not for anyone." Alani nodded. She pressed her cheek briefly to her father's arm. "Thank you for showing up when you did." Everett didn't reply. He just placed his hand gently on her shoulder and guided her forward. But his mind was already elsewhere. This wasn't the first time, and if he knew the airline's culture well enough, it wouldn't be the last. And as it turned out, he knew this airline very well. The air inside Flight Aurelian 228 felt stiff, not from the altitude, but from something else. Something more subtle. Tense. Jordan sat still in row 3, her shoulders squared, her lips pressed together in a faint, rehearsed smile. She'd been trained to do this, trained to look small in spaces designed to make her feel that way. Her carry-on sat in the overhead bin, quietly, unbothered, and yet it had become the target of a flight attendant's disapproval. "Miss, really, that—" Cassidy Ray had sneered earlier, her southern-laced voice laced with mockery that wasn't even thinly veiled. She'd looked down at the handmade carry-on as if it were a thrift store mistake instead of a beautiful, ethically crafted piece of innovation. Jordan hadn't responded then, not with words, only with silence, posture, and the quiet dignity passed down to her from generations before her. That, she had learned, was power too. Now, she watched Cassidy glide up and down the aisle, smiling at some passengers, skipping others. The ones she smiled at were, coincidentally, older, white, and dressed in business casual. She asked them if they'd like sparkling water or a pre-takeoff drink, but she passed right by row 3, right by Jordan. Jordan exhaled slowly. This wasn't the first time, probably wouldn't be the last. Her husband, Thomas Caldwell, was still on the tarmac. She knew that. He often boarded flights late, preferred it that way. Said it gave him a last moment to breathe before the pressurized air and even more pressurized expectations took over. He'd been on a call when she boarded, something about vendor negotiations, supply chain equity standards, and an internal audit. She smiled softly, thinking about him. He had no idea what had just happened, but he would. She wasn't one to cause a scene, never had been, but something had shifted this time. Not because Cassidy's comment had been especially vicious, it hadn't. It had been garden variety dismissal, casual prejudice dressed as customer service. But the fact that it came after everything Jordan had built, after years of staying quiet and working harder than most, stung differently. Especially because the bag Cassidy mocked, it was hers. Her design, her patent, her idea, born in a Brooklyn apartment with no central air and too many nights spent sketching by candlelight after the electricity got cut off. A luxury, ethical bag was what Vogue called it. Disruptive, carbon-neutral design, said another magazine, and now here it was, on Flight 228 dismissed as trash by someone who had no idea whose hands had sewn the inner lining. Jordan turned her head and looked out the oval window. The sky outside was a soft steel gray. Somewhere behind that cloud line, her ancestors were watching. She hoped they were proud. The seat beside her remained empty. For now, Cassidy reappeared. She paused in the aisle and leaned slightly over a middle-aged man 2 rows behind Jordan. "Can you believe the nerve?" Cassidy whispered with a smirk. "Some people really do think first class is for everybody now." Jordan didn't turn around, but her body stiffened. So did the man's. He chuckled lightly, but uncomfortably. He wasn't prepared for that comment, didn't ask for it, but Cassidy wasn't talking to him. Not really. She was talking at Jordan, loud enough for her to hear, like she wanted her to react, to flinch, to break. But Jordan had spent too many years holding her tongue, and too many more sharpening it in silence. She could wait. Cassidy moved on. The moment hung there between Jordan and the back of the cabin like a whisper that wouldn't die. 10 more minutes passed. Then a new energy entered the cabin. The boarding door whooshed open again, even though it had just closed. A few heads turned. Thomas Caldwell stepped onto the aircraft. His presence wasn't loud, but it was commanding. Not because of the tailored navy overcoat he wore or the soft leather briefcase in his left hand. It was his composure, like he had already taken the measure of the room without even glancing up. He offered a courteous nod to the pilot standing near the cockpit and exchanged a handshake with the gate agent before stepping into the cabin proper. Cassidy didn't recognize him at first. Why would she? She was busy adjusting a blanket for another passenger. But then the first officer stepped forward and said something softly in her ear. Her body went rigid. Jordan, who'd turned slightly in her seat, watched Cassidy's face transform. Her smile froze, eyes darting toward row 3 where Jordan sat, where the bag sat. Cassidy's lips thinned. Thomas reached row 3 and slid easily into the seat beside Jordan. "You okay?" he asked softly, his hand brushing hers. She gave a half smile. "Always." He looked at her a moment longer, then his eyes shifted toward the front of the plane. Cassidy stood 2 rows up, pretending to organize service trays. Jordan leaned toward him. She made a comment. She said, voice low, "About my bag, about me." Thomas stilled. "She doesn't know who I am, and that's fine. But she went out of her way to humiliate me. Twice, loud enough for others to hear." He nodded once. "Did you record it?" "No," Jordan said, "but the gentleman behind us might have." "He heard it all?" I think he felt uncomfortable. Thomas looked back, made brief eye contact with the man, who gave a sheepish nod and raised his phone slightly, indicating something had been saved. Jordan exhaled. She didn't feel vindicated, just tired. Thomas tapped a few notes into his phone, then pocketed it. He leaned closer. "Would you like me to say something now?" Jordan paused. Her eyes softened. "No, not yet. Let her finish her show." He nodded again. "Your call." That was one of the things she loved most about him. He always gave her the choice. Cassidy made her way back toward them finally, her smile tight. "Would you two like anything to drink before we take off?" she asked. Her voice, now sugar-slicked. Jordan met her eyes. "Just water." "Thank you." Thomas's tone was calm, sparkling, lime, if available. Cassidy nodded, retreating quickly. When she disappeared again, Jordan leaned back into her seat. The hum of the engine had started. Takeoff was minutes away. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. Inside her chest, her heartbeat thudded softly, not from fear, but focus. This wasn't over, and Cassidy had no idea what she'd just stepped into, because sometimes power doesn't wear a name tag. Sometimes it just waits in row 3. The gate agent scanned boarding passes with the glazed efficiency of someone halfway through a 12-hour shift. Passengers filed in with the usual blend of anticipation and exhaustion, business suits, carry-ons, headphones already in place. The buzz of conversation and overhead announcements created a low-level hum, interrupted only by the occasional boarding call or crying toddler. Autumn held her boarding pass between her fingers like it was a piece of paper that might suddenly disintegrate. She glanced again at the group number, Group 1. She had never flown Group 1 before. Her palms were damp, not from fear of flying, but from knowing eyes were about to be on her again. Some admiring, some questioning, some dismissive. First-class boarding now. The gate agent called. Autumn stepped forward, tightening her grip on her carry-on and the green duffel. She heard the woman behind her mutter under her breath. Group 1. With that bag, Autumn paused, uncertain whether to turn around or let it go. She chose the latter and handed the agent her pass. The scanner beeped. "Welcome aboard, Miss Whitfield," the agent said with a practiced smile. She nodded politely and walked toward the jet bridge, her heart thudding harder than it should. She reminded herself that the bag was handmade, that it was hers, that her husband had gifted it to her as a symbol of her work, her legacy, not a punchline. The warm cabin lights greeted her like soft candlelight after a long day. She breathed in the scent of new leather seats, citrus disinfectant, and faint espresso from the galley. Rows of plush recliners curved around the cabin's first-class section. Each seat came with privacy dividers, polished wood tray tables, and silent screens waiting to be awakened by fingertips. But before Autumn could settle in, a sharp voice cut through the low hum. "Excuse me, this cabin is for our first-class passengers only." Autumn turned, the same flight attendant, Chloe Mercer. Her smile was as thin as thread. Her tone wasn't hostile, but it was condescending, like a librarian scolding a child for stepping out of line. "I am a first-class passenger," Autumn said, steady but soft. Chloe didn't look at the boarding pass. She looked at the duffel again, the green canvas with its leather strap, the scuff near the zipper, the name tag hand-stitched onto the side that said simply, "A. W." "Oh," Chloe said, lips pursing. "Of course. My apologies. Please, right this way." The sarcasm was clear. Autumn didn't respond. She walked down the aisle toward her seat. Chloe followed closely behind, then gestured to 2A with a rehearsed sweep of her hand. Autumn stored the duffel in the overhead bin. She had packed it carefully: notebooks, a leather case with her glasses, a photo of her mother tucked inside the side pocket. She wasn't one to show things off, but today she almost wanted to leave the bag in plain sight. As she sat down, Chloe lingered. "We'll be serving a chilled herb couscous with grilled salmon shortly. Would you prefer sparkling water or something stronger?" Her tone now carried a clipped cheeriness, like someone biting into a lemon while pretending it was cake. "Water is fine," Autumn replied. Chloe nodded curtly and moved on. Autumn looked out the window. The tarmac buzzed with activity: fuel trucks, luggage carts, people with vests moving like ants with purpose. Her phone buzzed. A message from Elijah. "Boarded. Let me know if anything's off. I'm 5 rows back. No one's seen me yet." Autumn smiled faintly. He was right behind her. Elijah had booked the seat under a different name, one that wouldn't draw attention. He didn't need to. He could have taken over the whole cabin if he wanted to. But he didn't want spectacle. He wanted truth, observation, accountability. She typed back, "Same flight attendant. Already made a comment, but I'm fine. Let's just observe." She hit send and locked the phone, then took a breath. A few moments later, a man in a tailored Navy suit arrived at 2B. He smiled politely. "Hello there. Looks like I'm your seatmate. Michael Rivers," he said, holding out a hand. "Autumn Whitfield," she replied, shaking it. Michael placed his leather briefcase in the bin and settled into his seat. He wore the ease of someone used to privilege, not obnoxious, just unaware of the space he occupied. He looked over at her duffel with mild curiosity. "That yours?" he asked. "Yes," Autumn said, adjusting her seatbelt. "I made it myself. Years ago." Michael nodded. "Well, it's seen the world, huh? Something like that." Before he could say more, Chloe returned with the pre-flight drink tray. She handed Michael his drink with a beaming smile. "And for you?" she asked, looking at Autumn as if offering a second chance to prove herself worthy of sitting here. "Still just water," Autumn said. Chloe gave a tight nod and moved on. Michael looked at her, then at the retreating figure of Chloe. "She seems intense." Autumn gave a non-committal smile. "Let's just say we've met." Cabin doors closed, seatbelt signs lit up. The aircraft pushed back from the gate with a soft jerk, and the safety video began to play. As they taxied, Autumn stared straight ahead, but inside, her thoughts swirled. Was she overreacting? Was Chloe's tone really that bad? She had trained herself over years not to let small things consume her. microaggressions, slights, being overlooked. She'd built thick skin, but some days, thick skin felt like a prison. It made her quieter, made her doubt herself when she shouldn't. She thought about the young girl sitting in her place 10 years ago, the one who flew standby with borrowed bags and paper journals full of code and notes. That girl didn't have money, but she had hope. She had fire. She had dreams of building things no one thought a black woman in aerospace could build. And now, here she was, in first class, still being judged, but not broken. A voice came over the intercom. "Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff." The aircraft roared down the runway and lifted into the sky. As the seatbelt sign turned off, Autumn sat back and closed her eyes. She didn't need to win anyone over. She just needed the truth to be visible. And she knew Elijah was watching too. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft began to cruise at altitude. Conversations quieted into murmurs, and the soft hum of engines became a background lullaby. In seat 2A, Amaya Sutton looked out the window, though her thoughts were anything but calm. The soft reflection of her face on the glass reminded her of all the moments she had learned to hold her peace. Miles away from land, tens of thousands of feet above ground. She was still thinking about the insult masked as a comment. "That's a bold look for Coach. Huh." It repeated in her mind like an echo in an empty hall. Not just the words, but the smug smirk on the attendant's face. Jenna Carver had said it as if tossing a joke. But Amaya felt the deliberate intention behind it. The sneer had lingered too long. The eyes had scanned her too knowingly. That wasn't a joke. It was a jab, a challenge, and the worst part. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. She glanced down at her travel tote, a soft, sage-green canvas bag with brown leather handles and a tiny logo stitched near the seam. It looked ordinary at a glance. Only those in aerospace circles or boutique engineering knew it wasn't, because the bag wasn't just stylish, it was smart. Inside, the interior lining contained a proprietary heat-absorbing gel, one Amaya had helped design with her team, a thermal-reactive polymer blend she'd co-patented for high-altitude rescue drones. The material adapted to changing temperatures, reducing thermal signatures in sub-zero environments. The bag was lined with that very same technology, not because it needed to be, but because she could. But to Jenna, it was Coach-colored. Too bright, too loud, too much for someone who looked like Amaya. She hadn't planned to tell anyone who she was. She wanted to fly under the radar, quite literally. But that comment, that look, had stirred something deep. Not anger, not quite sadness either. Just that quiet weight of recognition. She knew that weight well. The first time it had settled on her shoulders was at 12. When a classmate's father said she was too sharp for a girl from your side of town. It came again in college when a professor suggested she might want to reconsider aerospace and focus on something more realistic. And again, when she was the only woman of color in a think tank of 14, and the waiter kept assuming she was someone's assistant. And now, at 37, the weight still visited her in unexpected ways, like a carry-on of invisible assumptions. Across the aisle, Noah Sutton sipped water slowly, watching his wife with careful eyes. He knew that look. It was the one she wore when something coiled inside her. Silent but tight, like a wire pulled too far. He leaned in slightly and whispered, "Do you want me to say something?" Amaya gave a small smile. "Not yet." They shared a glance. It was brief, but full of unspoken layers: trust, frustration, patience worn thin. Back in the galley, Jenna Carver leaned against the metal counter, scrolling through her tablet. She barely registered the polite passenger seated in 2A as anything more than an anomaly. The woman's outfit was elegant but bright, the bag too bold, the posture too sure. Jenna didn't like when people didn't fit the mold. Maya, her co-worker and junior flight attendant, walked in holding a service tray. "You all right?" Maya asked, noticing Jenna's tightened jaw. "I just don't like being talked down to." Jenna muttered, "That woman in 2A gave me attitude." Maya blinked. She just asked for a water refill. Jenna rolled her eyes. Yeah, in that tone, like she thinks she's better than everyone else. Flashy bag, flashy voice, flashy smile, coach seat vibes with first-class seats. Maya frowned but said nothing. She'd learned it was better to keep quiet when Jenna got like this. Still, she glanced down the aisle, feeling uneasy. The woman in 2A had been nothing but courteous. There was something off about Jenna's disdain. Back at her seat, Amaya took out her tablet and opened the document she'd been reviewing before takeoff. It was a proposal final formatting for a pitch to a European Climate Innovation Summit. One of the key design integrations for their aerospace unit included reusable fiber made from ocean plastics. Another personal mission. She began making edits, her fingers gliding across the screen. For a moment, she found calm in the task, until she heard Jenna's voice again. Louder this time. "Ma'am, you need to move your bag. It's disrupting the aisle clearance." Amaya blinked, turned slowly. Her bag was tucked neatly under her feet, not blocking anything. "Excuse me," she asked. Jenna was standing too close now. The corner of her mouth curled. I said, "Your bag needs to be stored properly. This is first class. We have standards." Passengers in nearby seats began to look over. Amaya could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "The bag is under the seat, just like you instructed earlier." "It's too large," Jenna said, her voice sharper now. "Please hand it over. I'll find a safer place for it." Noah stood up, voice calm but low. "Is there a safety concern, or are we making one up?" Jenna turned toward him. "Sir, I'm speaking with the passenger." Amaya's gaze didn't waver. She reached down, lifted the bag slowly, then looked Jenna in the eye. "You want to handle it, go ahead. Just be careful. There's adaptive thermal gel inside. I'd hate for it to activate unintentionally." Jenna's hand froze mid-reach. "Excuse me." Amaya smiled softly. "You asked me to hand over my bag. I'm just letting you know that its contents respond to temperature. It's made with aerospace-grade materials, patented, and currently under evaluation by the Federal Research Consortium. We test them on commercial aircraft, sometimes without announcing." For a moment, the galley was silent. Jenna blinked, suddenly unsure. "And you are?" "I lead the design team that built this," Amaya said gently. "Now please, if you'd like to inspect the contents, you're welcome to, but I'll need a manifest from corporate security before we hand over intellectual property." Noah cleared his throat. "Or I can get the legal team on a call right now." Maya, watching from the galley, stepped forward, wide-eyed. "Wait, are you Amaya Sutton?" Amaya looked over, surprised. Maya smiled nervously. "I read about your work in the latest issue of Flight Tech Digest. Your team won the engineering award last year." Amaya nodded slowly. "We did." The color drained from Jenna's face. Passengers around them were now alert, watching, a few subtly filming with their phones. Jenna stepped back without another word. Amaya sat down quietly, placed the bag back under her feet, and opened her tablet again. But her hands shook slightly now, not from fear, from the accumulated weight of too many moments like this one. Small humiliations, public tests, she had passed, again. But why should she still need to, at 37, a leader, an innovator, a woman, a black woman? Why must worth still need proving? And more importantly, what was she willing to do about it next? That thought stayed with her long after the plane resumed its quiet hum. The silence in the first-class cabin was no longer the calm kind. It had become thick and tight, as though the air itself were bracing for something. Amani sat still, her back straight, but her fingers curled ever so slightly around the edge of her seat tray. The weight of Jessica's stare still pressed on her, even if the flight attendant had finally walked away. Elise, seated just a few rows ahead, turned her head subtly, offering a soft glance of support. Amani caught it and nodded once. Not a word was spoken, but it was enough. In that fleeting moment, they recognized the code all women of color often knew, the silent solidarity that didn't need explanation, the shared history that didn't need narration. But what Jessica hadn't seen, and maybe never would, was that the bag wasn't just a luxury accessory. It was a scar, and scars were earned, not bought. The laptop bag had been a gift from Imani's late father, a man who spent 3 decades in the aerospace industry before passing from lung disease due to years of working without proper protection in underfunded factories. He had stitched the inner pocket himself, sewed her initials into the side during the summer after she got her MBA. The leather was worn smooth in places, not from age, but from travel over 42 countries, 110 cities, and too many red eyes to count. This wasn't just a bag, it was legacy, protection, faith, and battle armor. Jessica had mocked it, but in doing so, she'd touched a wound with dirty hands. As the drink cart rattled softly in the background, Imani leaned back. Her mind wandered. She thought of the dinner table arguments when she first applied for a job in aviation tech. Her mother had begged her to choose something easier, something safer. "They won't listen to a black woman," she had whispered one night when the house was quiet. "They'll use you until they don't need you, then send you home empty." And yet, here she was, 34, head of wearable aerospace interface systems for Skynera Innovations, and weeks away from announcing a patented pilot assist device that could shift how commercial crews navigated emergency procedures. The very same bag Jessica had ridiculed contained 2 prototypes, each one more valuable than the entire luxury handbag shelf at the mall Jessica probably swore by. She sighed quietly and stared out the oval window. The clouds drifted like forgotten thoughts, just floating there, silent but unmissable. And then, as if called by that silence, movement returned to the front of the cabin. Jessica was back. Her posture was tense. Her hands were no longer folded in tight control, but fidgeting at her sides. And behind her stood a man in a crisp navy blazer and gray trousers, his salt and pepper beard trimmed neatly, his sharp eyes scanning the aisle like a general surveying his troops. Everyone looked up. Some passengers straightened instinctively, sensing importance. Others merely leaned to the side to get a better view. He said nothing at first, only walked to where Jessica had been standing moments before and glanced down at Imani. "Ma'am," he said calmly, I understand there may have been a misunderstanding." Jessica opened her mouth as if to say something, but his hand rose slightly, not to silence her but to save her from making things worse. Imani didn't rise, she didn't flinch, she simply looked up and said, "Yes." She mocked my bag, questioned if I belonged in this section, and made several passengers uncomfortable, myself included. Jessica's mouth tightened. Her lip curled slightly, as if she wanted to say something clever. But it was too late. The man slowly turned to the rest of the cabin. For everyone's clarity, my name is Gabriel Rios. I'm the interim CEO of Blue Ridge Airlines. I was flying commercial today for a personal reason, but I guess fate prefers irony. Gasps and murmurs flared like wildfire down the aisle. One man in business casual nearly choked on his complimentary almonds. I was told there was a customer service issue in this cabin. I asked for the manifest and security footage. Gabriel continued, his voice steady but razor sharp. And now that I've seen both, I want to make a few things absolutely clear. He turned fully toward Jessica now. I don't care what your tenure is. I don't care how many miles you've logged. Mocking a passenger's belongings, especially when they pose no safety issue, isn't policy. It's prejudice, dressed in polyester. A woman in 3A let out an audible breath. Someone clapped just once, then stopped. Unsure if it was appropriate, Gabriel wasn't done. And as for this passenger, he gestured toward Imani. You picked the wrong bag to laugh at. That bag is part of a tech suite developed by Skynara, our direct partner on the AeroSafe 2.0 initiative. The person carrying it helped design a patent that will be installed on every one of our aircraft within 18 months. Jessica turned pale. Her hand fluttered to her name badge, as if somehow it could protect her now. Effective immediately. Gabriel said quietly, You are relieved of all in-flight duties. Will land in Denver, not Portland. You'll be met by someone from HR. There was no dramatic exit, no shouting, just a slow, silent walk down the aisle as Jessica collected her things, eyes never leaving the floor. And then Gabriel did something no one expected. He knelt slightly, meeting Imani's gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, voice lowered so only she could hear. "Not just for today, for the years before it too. We're going to do better." For a moment. She didn't speak, then she nodded and said, "Don't just do better. Build systems that don't let this happen quietly again." His expression shifted, from apology to understanding, then to respect. And as he stood, passengers began to murmur again, this time not in confusion but in awe. The girl with the bag, she had just changed the course of an airline. Silence had a peculiar sound aboard Flight 414 that afternoon. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from peace. It was the silence that draped itself over a room after something sacred had been violated. Alina sat perfectly still in seat 2A, her fingers clutching the fabric of her jacket, eyes locked on the tiny window to her right. The clouds drifted by in slow motion, as if even the sky was waiting for the next moment to unfold. Across the aisle, Harlan, now seated and watching everything, rested his hands gently on the tray table in front of him. He hadn't said much since returning from the galley, where he had spoken with the flight crew and reviewed security footage. There had been some kind of invisible shift in him. He was still kind, still composed, but now he was something else too. Stillness with authority. Julianne, the flight attendant who had mocked Alina's bag, hadn't returned since her confrontation with Harlan. A different crew member now moved through the cabin quietly. her eyes avoiding contact, but her service meticulous and sincere. Alina's mother, Yvette, sat beside her daughter, her hand gently resting on the girl's shoulder. Her expression was unreadable, the quiet fury of a mother who had seen too much and for far too long, tried to protect her child from the same world that once scarred her. "You didn't do anything wrong," Yvette whispered to her daughter again. She had already said it once, but some wounds needed that balm more than once. Alina finally turned to her mother and gave a quiet nod. Her lips trembled slightly. Then she looked across the aisle at Harlan. He met her eyes and offered a small smile. The aircraft continued its course toward New York, but something intangible in its atmosphere had shifted. The cabin no longer felt like a transport vessel. It felt like a courtroom. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "Excuse me." A woman from the rear of first class stood up. Her voice was firm but respectful. She looked to Harlan. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I saw what happened earlier. I saw how she spoke to the girl, and I think someone needs to say this out loud." Her name, as it turned out, was Deborah Langston. She was a pediatric oncologist from Boston, and she had been flying back from a medical conference in Denver. She made that child feel small. Deborah said, not because of the bag, not because of policy, but because she thought no one would stand up for her. Harlan tilted his head slightly, listening, not interrupting. "I've seen too many kids shrink under the weight of what adults project onto them. That little girl," she said, gesturing to Alina, "should be walking into her future with her chin high and heart proud, not learning, at 10 years old, how to stay quiet to survive." The cabin grew still again. Another man stood up, then another. "I saw it too," said a software engineer in row 3. It wasn't just what was said, it was how it was said. Like she didn't expect her to be smart, or polite, or human. Like she assumed she didn't belong here, said a third passenger. Alina looked around now, her small face starting to register something she hadn't expected. People were seeing her, and not the kind of seeing that made you feel cornered or judged, but the kind that wrapped around your shoulders like a warm coat. For the first time since the incident, she reached for her bag again and placed it gently in her lap. Her fingers traced the embroidered edges. Yvette glanced at her daughter, then up at the passengers who had stood in solidarity. Tears filled her eyes, but she held them. "You have no idea what this means," she said softly. Harlan finally rose from his seat again. The murmurs ceased. "I do," he said. His voice didn't need to rise to be heard. "There are things a camera can't capture," he began. A downward glance, a tightening of the lips, the kind of disdain that moves faster than any policy can catch. He looked at Alina. What happened today was not a procedural misunderstanding. It was a moment of prejudice dressed in professionalism. His eyes turned to the other passengers, and it wasn't just witnessed, it was recorded, it was felt, and it will be responded to. He paused and looked around the cabin. "I believe in systemic change, but systems don't change until people do." The flight attendants near the galley watched, unsure whether they were still in command of the cabin or if they had become spectators in a truth they could no longer deflect. "What happened today," Harlan continued, "is not a standalone moment. It is part of a pattern, and patterns can be interrupted, must be interrupted." He took a step closer to Alina's seat. "Alina," he said gently, "this is your seat, your place, your presence. Don't ever let anyone convince you it's borrowed." The girl looked up at him, unsure how to respond, but her mother, quietly overwhelmed, reached for her hand. "Thank you," she whispered, and though it wasn't loud, the cabin heard it. It echoed in the places words often fail to reach. People settled back into their seats. The mood remained heavy, but something else had taken root. A reckoning. Something inside Alina had shifted too. She straightened her posture, clutched her bag gently, and leaned back into her seat not in retreat, but in presence. Not because she was trying to disappear, but because she finally knew she didn't have to. The flight resumed its quiet hum, the soft rumble of the engines, the overhead lights casting a gentle glow, and the occasional clink of a drink cart echoed the rhythm of routine. But inside row 3A, Camille was far from calm. Her fingertips rested against the window pane, tracing the condensation. Her reflection slightly distorted in the glass. Every second that passed twisted something deeper inside her. It wasn't just what happened to Amira that unsettled her. It was the recognition that this wasn't an isolated moment. It was the slow erosion of dignity she had witnessed, over and over again, in the smallest, subtlest forms. She turned her eyes toward Amira, now quietly sketching in her journal. The corners of the girl's lips turned upward as her pencil danced across the page, capturing shapes only she could imagine. Camille couldn't tell whether the piece on Amira's face was a triumph or a resignation. Children have an uncanny way of hiding bruises behind imagination. Just then, another passenger approached. "Excuse me," a woman said gently, her voice carrying the polite caution of someone stepping into territory not entirely her own. She was older, with silver-streaked hair and soft brown eyes. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened earlier, and the way you handled it with your daughter, it was graceful." Camille blinked, her jaw stiffening before she managed a soft "thank you." "I'm sorry it happened," the woman added, before slipping back to her seat. A tiny moment, a few kind words, but they cracked something open in Camille. That quiet apology from a stranger felt more real than any corporate press release could. She leaned back, eyes closed, willing herself to steady. She was exhausted not from travel, but from carrying the weight of always being the calm one, the reasonable one, even when others weaponized ignorance as policy. She remembered something Elias once said on a particularly rough day: "The world doesn't always deserve your grace, but I do, and so does she." Her phone buzzed gently in her lap. A message from Elias. Circling back sooner. Tell her to keep drawing. She smiled in spite of everything. He always knew, even when he was 2 time zones away or sitting across a negotiation table with board members who called him too intense when he demanded equity clauses. He always knew. Across the aisle, the flight attendant. Jessica continued to work. Her movements had stiffened, her smile tighter, her tone clipped. She was clearly aware the atmosphere had shifted, but she carried on as though nothing had happened, as though Camille's silence meant surrender. It didn't. Camille reached for her bag, not the overnight one stowed under the seat, but the one Amira had lovingly designed. Her fingers brushed over the surface. It was unlike anything mass-produced, a patchwork of vibrant colors and textures. One of the zipper pulls had the word "hope" sewn into it in bright orange thread. Camille unzipped it, pulled out her tablet, and opened her encrypted dashboard. She wasn't just a wife and mother, she was also head of strategic ethics at Zephyr Air, a detail she had not felt the need to flash earlier. Some power is not worn, but wielded quietly. She tapped into her secure connection and opened the internal incident logging system. There were multiple options for category, discrimination, inappropriate staff conduct, mishandling of passenger property. She checked them all, then she began to type. Every word mattered, every detail. Not just to defend her daughter, but because she knew there were others who couldn't log in, who didn't have access, who wouldn't be believed. She was going to make this one count. After submitting the report, she sat back again and watched Amira draw. The girl was working on a new sketch now. A woman standing at the edge of a cliff, her cape fluttering behind her, hair wild in the wind, arms stretched out like wings. Camille blinked, caught off guard. "What's that one about?" she asked. Amira looked up. "She's jumping." "Is she scared?" Camille asked. "No," Amira said. "She's flying." Camille bit the inside of her cheek. The image stayed with her long after Amira turned back to shading in the clouds. The fear, the fall, the flight, it was all part of the same story. Later, as dinner trays were passed out, Jessica returned. "Would you care for the vegetarian option or chicken?" Her tone was professional, almost too smooth, like it had been practiced. Camille met her eyes and replied softly, "I'm not hungry, but thank you." Jessica paused, a flicker of something crossing her face. Was it guilt or calculation? She turned quickly and moved on. No apology, no acknowledgement, just routine. That, Camille realized, was the real insult, pretending like it never happened. As the meal service ended and the lights dimmed, Camille wrapped a blanket around Amira, who had curled up against the window, already half asleep. She looked peaceful now, but Camille could still feel the thread of tension beneath her daughter's breathing. From behind them, a quiet voice whispered, "Ma'am." It was the same elderly woman from earlier. "If you don't mind, I'd like to send a letter to the airline about what I witnessed. Would you be okay if I mention your names?" Camille smiled softly. "Of course, thank you." She didn't realize how much she needed that allyship until it came, unexpected and quiet. Not a grand gesture, just someone willing to bear witness. That was sometimes the most powerful thing of all. By the time Camille checked her phone again, a second message from Elias had appeared. "Gate has been alerted. Situation is already escalating. I'll meet you as soon as you land." She knew what that meant. Elias wasn't just circling back. He was coming in hot, and whatever mask Jessica had chosen to wear, it was about to be peeled off layer by layer. And still, Camille's heart didn't surge with vengeance, just resolve, because this wasn't about punishment. It was about pattern, and patterns had to be broken, not just named. The hum of the plane softened into night. Camille closed her eyes, her daughter's breath steady beside her, and let herself rest. Tomorrow, the real conversation would begin. The silence in the cabin was unnatural, not the peaceful kind that comes with altitude and white clouds, but the dense, weighted kind, as if everyone had agreed without speaking that something had gone terribly wrong. Talia sat perfectly still in her seat, but her hands betrayed her. One was wrapped tightly around the strap of her daughter's handmade bag. The other trembled just slightly on her lap. The woman who had spoken truth to a flight attendant with unshakable calm now felt the buzz of chaos closing in. Isla, sitting beside her, held her mother's hand. Her small fingers squeezed tight, not out of fear but out of something else, intuition. Isla had always been perceptive beyond her years. She had watched the adults around her switch tones like masks. She had seen that kindness was often conditional. Across the aisle, the passengers who had witnessed the commotion were whispering. A few looked guilty. Others looked afraid. Some stared at Isla like she had done something wrong simply by being composed, by being proud. Talia felt the burn of that gaze. She'd spent her whole life learning to deflect it. In Ivy Hollow, where she grew up, her mother taught her that silence was often the loudest act of resistance. But today, on this aircraft, her silence had been mocked, her dignity challenged, and now her daughter had become part of it. "Mom," Isla whispered, "why do people look at me like that?" Talia didn't answer right away. She didn't want to lie, but the truth was too big, too sharp, because sometimes, when people see strength in someone they expect to be quiet, they get confused. She finally said, "And when people are confused, they can be unkind." Asla didn't reply. She only nodded and leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. At the front of the cabin, Supervisor Kendra Sloan was frantically pacing. She had taken a phone call moments ago, and her tone had shifted dramatically. The haughtiness that had coated her words when mocking Isla's bag was gone. In its place was a cold panic she was struggling to disguise. She pulled flight attendant Lena aside near the service station. "We need to fix this now. Do you hear me? This could ruin us." I had no idea she was related to someone that high up. Lena looked over toward Talia and Isla. "I think it's too late for fixing." Kendra's jaw tightened. She turned to speak with the pilot, who had stepped out of the cockpit, looking more alarmed by the unfolding situation than the turbulence warning from earlier. Passengers began murmuring louder now. A woman in the second row, a middle-aged traveler in a cream cardigan, stood up and addressed the flight crew. "Excuse me, are you going to explain why this family is being treated like a problem?" Kendra's mask cracked. Her voice was tight and rehearsed. "Ma'am, please remain seated. We are addressing a sensitive matter." Sensitive. The woman narrowed her eyes. "You mean humiliating? I watched the whole thing. I heard what was said to that girl. You owe them an apology." Kendra looked like she might snap, but didn't. Instead, she turned and vanished into the galley. Talia exhaled slowly, her hand resting over Isla's head. She wasn't surprised, but she was tired. Tired in the way only black women know. Not just physical fatigue, but soul fatigue. The kind that builds over years of holding your breath in boardrooms, grocery stores, and now first-class cabins. Then a familiar voice pierced the heavy silence. "Excuse me. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll need your attention for a moment." It was the pilot, but his voice carried something different this time. Not the smooth neutrality of a professional routine, but the tense cadence of a man aware of consequences. "We've been instructed to pause the flight momentarily. There is a high-priority protocol being activated. We are awaiting clearance from headquarters before continuing our route." A murmur spread like wildfire through the cabin. Talia sat up straighter. Her chest thudded once against her rib cage. Something was happening. She glanced down at her phone. One bar of service flickered on and off. The patchy mid-air signal had been a blessing in disguise. She'd managed to send the video and a short message. Just 5 words. They mocked Isla's bag again. That was all she'd needed to send, because she knew who was waiting on the other end. Her husband, Jalen Monroe, CEO of Astara Airlines. She had not invoked his name before. Not at the gate when the stairs came. Not when Isla's handmade gift was ridiculed. Not even when Kendra leaned down with venom and condescension. But she had always known this moment would come, because she knew the world too well. She had lived inside its cracks, and she also knew her husband, knew how he carried stillness like a sword. Jalen was not the kind of man who roared. He was the kind who arrived without warning and changed everything simply by being seen. And so, when the cockpit door opened again, and Jalen Monroe stepped into the aisle, dressed in a fitted Navy business jacket with quiet eyes and presence like gravity, the plane went silent. The passengers didn't recognize him at first, but Kendra did. Her eyes widened. Her breath caught. She took one unsteady step forward. "Mr. Monroe? I wasn't told you were on, I wasn't," Jalen said calmly. "I was briefed, midair, about what happened to my daughter." Gasps rose from the rows behind them. All heads turned. Talia didn't move. She simply watched. Her husband was here. But she had already stood up for herself, already protected their daughter. Still, his presence cracked something open inside her that she had held together too long. Kendra's voice was shaking now. "Sir, I assure you, it's a misunderstanding." "I deeply regret," Jalen interrupted gently, "is only meaningful when it's accompanied by accountability." He turned to the cabin, his voice measured but clear. "My name is Jalen Monroe. I'm the CEO of Airlines. I wasn't supposed to be on this flight, but when I received a message from my wife, I decided to board from the emergency access point in Omaha during the refueling stop." The murmurs turned into stunned silence. "I didn't come here for spectacle. I came because I needed to see what we have allowed to continue inside our company. I watched the footage. I heard the words. I saw my daughter try to shrink herself to make an adult feel more powerful, and that is not a culture we will tolerate." He paused. Talia blinked hard. Her hand slipped into Isla's. Jalen looked directly at Kendra. "You are relieved of your duties effective immediately. HR will meet you when we land. Security has been notified." Kendra's knees buckled slightly. Her lips parted, but no words came. Jalen then turned to Lena. "You will give my wife and daughter the dignity they should have been given at the gate." Lena nodded silently, eyes lowered. He looked around the cabin one final time, and to every passenger who witnessed this, "I thank those of you who spoke up. This is your airline, too. Hold us to better." Then he walked down the aisle and sat beside Talia and Isla. No more words, just presence, just power, silent and full. And Isla looked up at him and smiled, like everything had been set right, even if the world still had far to go. The first few minutes after the seat change were filled with silence. Elena sat quietly beside the window in row 8, looking out at the clouds streaking by like paint across a canvas. Her hands rested on her lap, her fingers curled into each other. She didn't cry, not anymore. She had done her crying when the flight attendant humiliated her, when eyes burned into her skin as if she were wrong for being there. Jackson sat next to her, his body still, his jaw tense. He hadn't said much since they moved. There was a fury in him she'd never seen before, and he was trying desperately not to let it explode. Elena turned to him. "Dad, it's okay." His eyes finally met hers. "It's not okay," he said, his voice low. "None of this is okay." She sighed. "But maybe, if we just let it go, the flight will be over soon." Jackson leaned back in his seat, looking up at the ceiling of the plane like he was trying to find air that wasn't there. He had spent decades learning how to stay composed in the face of injustice. But this wasn't about contracts or shareholder meetings. This was his daughter, his baby girl. A soft voice interrupted their moment. "Excuse me." It was the elderly woman who had seen everything earlier. Her name, she said, was Clara Hensley. She was in her 70s, white, with kind eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. She leaned over the aisle, holding a napkin. On it was a note, folded carefully. "I saw what happened. I'm so sorry," she said, handing Elena the note. "I don't want to cause more attention, but I think it's important you know not everyone agrees with what that woman did." Elena opened it slowly. In neat handwriting were the words, "You belong wherever you sit. You carry yourself with grace. Never let anyone dim your shine. With love." See, Elena's throat tightened. She looked at Clara and nodded, speechless. Sometimes the smallest acts of decency feel like lifelines. Clara gave a small smile and returned to her seat. Jackson turned his head toward the window. He blinked hard, not because he was weak, but because he knew that quiet moments like this had the power to heal wounds that noise never could. But peace was fleeting. Suddenly, the overhead speakers crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Lawrence speaking. We've just been informed of an unexpected inspection upon landing in Dallas. Please remain seated once we arrive. Thank you." Jackson's head snapped toward the front of the plane. He hadn't made a call. Not yet. So who had? He looked toward the back of the cabin and noticed a man in a dark navy suit rising from his seat in row 25. The man made his way down the aisle calmly, stopping briefly at the galley where Reese stood speaking to her co-worker. The man showed her a badge. She stiffened immediately. He turned slightly and scanned the cabin before making eye contact with Jackson. He gave a small nod. Jackson's phone buzzed. A message flashed. "Your family was on our watch list since the Aurora merger. FAA oversight already initiated. Stay quiet. We're handling it." The message was from his assistant, Marla, who didn't waste time. Elena leaned in. "What's going on?" Jackson hesitated, but decided not to hide the truth from her. "There are systems in place, baby," he said softly. "Even when people think they're untouchable. Sometimes the world watches, quietly." She frowned. "Are we being investigated?" "No," he said. "They are." Reese looked visibly shaken. Her stiff posture and rigid smile were gone. The suited man spoke to her in hushed tones. Her responses were clipped and defensive. As he handed her a document, a few nearby passengers subtly leaned in to eavesdrop. Then a voice from the row behind Jackson whispered, "Is that a federal agent?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The quiet in the cabin turned electric. Jackson turned to Elena. "You don't need to carry their shame," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong." She nodded slowly. "Then why does it still hurt? Because dignity always feels heavier when people try to strip it from you, but that doesn't mean it's gone." The flight attendant in the rear cabin, a younger woman named Tessa, walked up to Jackson's seat and whispered, "Mr. Ward, I saw what happened earlier. I'm really sorry. That wasn't right." He looked up at her. "Thank you. Your voice matters." Tessa bit her lip. "Reese has done this before. I just didn't know how to speak up. But I'm ready now." Elena's eyes widened. "She's done this to other passengers?" Tessa nodded. "Last month, there was a black mother with twins. Reese gave her grief over having 2 carry-ons for her kids. Said she was holding up boarding. She cried in the bathroom. Nobody reported it. Jackson kept his voice steady. Would you be willing to say that again? Tessa looked over her shoulder, then back at him. I will now. I'm tired of being silent. As she walked back, Elena turned to her dad. You think this will change anything? He smiled faintly. It already is. The cabin buzzed with quiet conversations. People were aware now, not everyone, but enough. Even those who had once looked away now looked around, watching, listening. The silence was no longer complicity, it was attention. When the seatbelt sign lit up, the captain's voice returned. Ladies and gentlemen, we're making our final descent into Dallas. Please ensure your seats are upright and tray tables stowed. As the plane dipped toward the runway, Elena leaned her head on Jackson's shoulder. Thanks for standing up for me, she said. He kissed the top of her head. Always. That's what fathers do, especially when the world forgets who you are. They didn't speak again until the wheels touched down. But in that silence, there was strength, and in that silence, the reckoning had already begun. The cabin felt strangely silent after the earlier commotion. The air was heavy with unspoken questions and suppressed emotion. Even the soft rumble of the engine seemed to hold its breath. Ava sat still in her seat, her arms loosely folded, her gaze fixed out the window. But she wasn't seeing the clouds anymore. She was thinking, remembering, replaying every detail of the incident with Lorna and the whisper that had come before the storm. Jonas sat beside her now, no longer speaking. He had respected her need for space, which she appreciated deeply. He offered his presence like an anchor, not a lifeline, and Ava found comfort in that. From across the aisle, passengers glanced at her in quiet recognition, not just because they now knew who her husband was, but because something had shifted in their perception. The black girl with the worn backpack was no longer invisible. She was undeniable. Mara had returned to her jump seat, eyes cast low, her usual performative cheer replaced by something Ava couldn't name. It wasn't quite guilt. It was too guarded for that. It looked more like shame trying to hide beneath protocol. The intercom buzzed. Ladies and gentlemen, the pilot's voice said slowly, this is your captain. We will be experiencing a slight change in crew operations for the remainder of this flight. Please remain in your seats as our in-flight management team completes some final checks. Thank you. It was formal, it was controlled, but everyone knew something bigger was underway. Ava turned to Jonas quietly. Are you going to terminate the crew mid-air? His eyes met hers, calm, steady. I'm not here to punish. Ava, he said, I'm here to reset the standard. What happened to you, to us, wasn't just about one flight attendant. It was about a culture, and culture must be answered in public. Ava leaned back and closed her eyes. The weight of those words sunk deep. She wasn't interested in revenge. She never had been, but clarity, accountability, that was necessary. Moments later, a soft knock came at their row. It was an older flight attendant, not one who had been on duty during the incident. Mrs. Walker, she said, with a careful kindness in her voice, Captain Hayes has asked if you'd be willing to speak briefly in the galley. Just you? He said it's entirely voluntary. Ava blinked, surprised. Me, the woman nodded. He believes your voice might help, guide what happens next. Ava hesitated for just a moment, then nodded slowly. She stood, adjusting the strap on her bag instinctively, though it now rested safely in the overhead bin untouched since Jonas had returned it. The galley at the rear of the cabin was dimly lit, quiet. A second uniformed attendant stood there beside the captain, a tall black man in his early 50s named Captain Raymond Hayes. His face was worn with miles and command, but his eyes were kind, real kind. "Ms. Walker," he said, extending a hand. "Or may I say, Ava." She shook it gently. "Ava's fine." He motioned to a jump seat, and she took it slowly. "I know this isn't what you expected when you boarded this flight," he said, his voice low and sincere, "and I know it's not your job to educate anyone on what they should already know." Ava gave him a soft, tired smile. "I appreciate that. But," he continued, "as the acting senior officer on this aircraft, I'd like to offer you something I believe you've long been denied. A say, not just in how you were treated, but in how we begin again." Ava tilted her head. "Begin again." Captain Hayes folded his arms. "This flight, and every flight after, has a choice to make. Who do we become when we are witnessed? When we are wrong, do we protect the image, or do we confront the truth?" He let that hang in the air. Ava didn't rush to respond. Instead, she drew a quiet breath and looked at him fully. "I didn't ask to be a symbol," she said. "I didn't dress to make a statement. I didn't pack to prove anything. I boarded a plane with my husband, sat in the seat we paid for, and carried a bag I've loved since college. And that was enough to invite disdain, suspicion, cruelty, not because of what I did, but because of who they thought I was." Captain Hayes nodded. "That truth," he said, "needs to be written into every training manual, every hiring process, every moment of this company's culture moving forward." Ava hesitated. Her voice, when it came, was clear. "Then start here. Begin with accountability. Not just for Mara, but for the systems that trained her, protected her, normalized her behavior. Let this flight be the last one where judgment boards before welcome, and make sure the next black girl with a backpack is greeted with humanity, not suspicion." Captain Hayes placed a hand over his heart. "We will." As Ava returned to her seat, something in her had shifted. Not because she'd won, but because she'd been heard. And sometimes being heard was the first revolution. Jonas looked at her with a quiet question in his eyes. "Let's finish the flight," she said softly, "and then change every single one that follows." Behind them, passengers murmured with cautious hope. In front of them, the cabin light flickered softly as the sun dipped behind a wall of clouds. Somewhere far below, the country they flew over continued with its ordinary chaos. But on this plane, at this altitude, a new kind of order had begun to take shape. And Ava Walker, the girl with the mocked bag, now carried something far heavier and far more powerful, the truth, and she was never putting it down again. The hum of the engines was steady, a low vibration beneath their feet. In the cockpit of Flight 907, Captain Miles Thatcher sat in the co-pilot's seat, his hands resting silently on his thighs. Across from him, First Officer Priya Mehta adjusted the controls with a steady hand, though her face was unusually tight, behind the locked door. The rest of the aircraft buzzed with the aftershock of everything that had happened. Every conversation in the cabin hummed like static electricity, muffled but heavy. Miles stared straight ahead. He had not spoken since Commander Reese left. The words she had spoken about justice, about integrity, about silence had left something cracked open inside him. In his hand was the letter. Not the one Dr. Reese had handed to the flight crew. This one had been slipped quietly into the cockpit doorframe by a young flight tech just before takeoff. Miles had almost forgotten about it in the chaos. Now, he unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was clean, confident, and dated 2 days ago. To the person at the front of the plane. I do not know who will be in this seat, but if you are reading this, it means you still have a chance to choose which kind of story this flight will tell. My name is Camilla Reese. I work in silence. I watch how people treat one another when they think no one is watching. I record what is said behind closed doors, and sometimes I sit quietly in seat 14A while the story unfolds. If you're reading this, I hope you remember what power looks like. It does not always shout. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it waits. But when it moves, it changes everything. Miles set the letter down gently. His chest tightened. He thought of his early flying years. He had been a young man then, full of dreams and fire, swearing to his instructors that he would be the kind of captain that made the sky a fair place. But then came the politics, the corners cut, the silent complicity. Now, here he was, watching a black teenager get shamed in public, a woman disrespected for her skin, and his own crew weaponize policies they barely understood. He ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. In the reflection of the instrument panel, he barely recognized himself. Priya finally broke the silence. "You okay?" "Miles." He nodded but didn't speak. Then, after a moment, he said quietly, "We've crossed a line. Priya, and not just today. A long time ago." Priya looked over. Her brows softened. "You're not the only one thinking that," she replied. He turned toward her slowly. "Do you think she knew that I would read it? I think she hopes you'll do something about it." A knock interrupted them. It was soft, tentative. Miles opened the cockpit door and saw Rachel standing there, the junior flight attendant. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her voice was hoarse. "Captain, I need to say something." He stepped back. "Come in." Rachel clutched a folded slip of paper and held it out. "It's my resignation. I can't be part of this anymore." Miles did not take the paper. He looked her in the eyes. What changed, Rachel looked down. "Her name is Ava. She reminds me of my niece. When I heard the way Lana spoke to her, when I saw the way no one stood up, her voice cracked. I saw my own silence, and it made me sick." Miles nodded slowly. "You're not alone in that." Rachel looked startled. "What do we do now?" He finally reached for her resignation note, but instead of reading it, he folded it again and placed it on the console. "You write a new one," he said quietly, "one that helps fix what broke." Rachel blinked. "You want me to stay. I want you to be the kind of person that Ava and people like her need in the sky." Outside the cockpit, Ava sat beside Camilla. Her curls fell over her face as she stared out the window. She had not spoken much in the last 20 minutes. Camilla held her hand. "You did nothing wrong. Ava." "I know," Ava said softly, "but it still feels like—" Everyone looked away. Camilla nodded. "Because for a moment they did, but that moment is passing now." Ava turned to look at her. "Why does this happen?" "Ms." Reese Camilla was quiet for a long while. Then she said gently, "Because the people who should speak forget the cost of staying quiet. But you didn't stay quiet, and that matters." A few rows up. Lana sat stiffly. Her arms were crossed, and her eyes darted around nervously. She had not spoken since she was pulled aside by security and informed that the chief compliance officer for Horizon Air was on board. The same person she had mocked. The same person she had dismissed as just another black woman making noise. Every fiber in her being wanted to call someone, anyone. But her phone had been locked out of service. The flight's secure communications were under new oversight, and she knew why. She was now a guest on someone else's ship. A slow voice echoed over the intercom. It was Captain Thatcher. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to take a moment to acknowledge something more important than turbulence or time zones. Sometimes, the true journey we take isn't measured in miles, but in how we treat the person next to us." The cabin fell into a hush. Today, we witnessed something that should never have happened. I did not act when I should have. For that, I apologize, and I'm committed to correcting that failure. A pause. I hope, for everyone here, this flight becomes more than just a trip. I hope it becomes a turning point. Rachel, standing in the galley, wept quietly. Ava closed her eyes and leaned into Camilla's arm. And somewhere in the business class cabin, a middle-aged woman took out her phone and began typing. A tweet. Flight 907. A black teen girl was mocked for her bag. Her mother stayed quiet until the pilot spoke. I'll never forget this flight. It would be the first of hundreds, and the story was only just beginning. The flight descended slowly into Boston's Logan International Airport. Outside the window, the clouds parted to reveal a city wrapped in late autumn light. From her window seat, Amira pressed her forehead gently against the cool glass. She wasn't thinking about the city or the meetings that awaited her husband. She was thinking about the letter she had written in her head 1,000 times, a letter she might never send, across the aisle. Owen sat with his hand gently holding hers. He had not let go since that moment in the galley, since everything had unraveled, since the truth about who they were shattered the assumptions of nearly everyone on board. Lena, seated beside her mother, was uncharacteristically quiet. Her headphones sat around her neck, and the little toy airplane she had been gripping earlier now rested on the fold-out tray. Amira reached over, gently stroking her daughter's braids. Lena looked up, and for the first time since the chaos started, she smiled. "You're still my superhero, Mommy," she whispered. Amira's throat tightened. She leaned in and kissed Lena's forehead. No words could touch that kind of love. As the landing gear dropped, the intercom crackled. Captain Sims, who had offered his personal apology earlier, cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be touching down in approximately 5 minutes. On behalf of the crew, we'd like to thank you for your patience and extend our sincere apologies to any passengers who were affected by today's events. Our airline does not and will never tolerate discrimination or disrespect toward any customer. Thank you for choosing Regal Atlantic. We wish you a meaningful and peaceful journey ahead." There was a silence across the cabin after his message. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that makes people look inward, reflect, learn. As they taxied toward the gate, there was movement near the back. A tall woman in a sharp navy pantsuit stood up and began walking down the aisle. It was the new director of customer relations, Lisa Bennett, who had joined the flight midair when the executive team was rerouted to meet the plane in Boston. She had reviewed security footage and the passengers' statements during the descent. Lisa stopped beside Amira's row and offered a composed but sincere expression. "Mrs. Thornton, I'd like to personally offer our apology. What happened to you and your daughter was unacceptable." Amira stood slowly. Her voice was low but resonant. "Thank you. I hope it leads to real change, not just for me. For the next mother who boards a plane with a child and doesn't look like she belongs in first class." Lisa nodded. "I've already initiated a full internal review. Ms. Paget has been suspended indefinitely pending further investigation." From the galley, a flight attendant gasped softly, realizing what that meant. Lisa continued, "We've also launched a new crew training initiative, and your story, with your permission, will be part of that curriculum." Amira blinked, surprised. "You want them to see what happened, they need to," Lisa replied. "We've hidden behind rules and protocols for too long. It's time we start listening instead of assuming." Amira sat back down, a quiet storm of emotion swirling beneath her skin. Progress. It didn't undo the hurt, but it mattered. As the plane came to a halt, passengers stood slowly, and for once, no one rushed to the front. Many stopped by Amira's seat. Some offered nods. Others shared soft-spoken apologies or encouragement. One older man, who had earlier looked away during the confrontation, paused. "I didn't speak up when I should have. I'm sorry for that." Amira met his eyes. "Your silence hurt, but your voice now counts. Please don't stay silent next time." He nodded, quietly moved, as the doors opened and the cold Boston air slipped into the cabin. Amira and Owen gathered their belongings. Lena clutched her bag, the one that started it all. No one said a word about it now. They stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge. The ground felt different, like something had shifted, not just in the world, but in themselves. Outside, media vans had already gathered. Word had traveled. Cameras pointed toward them as they exited. But Owen gently shielded Lena with his arm. Amira squeezed his hand. "Do we talk?" Owen looked at her. "If you want to." Amira paused, then took a deep breath. She stepped forward. The cameras zoomed in. "I'm Amira Thornton. What happened to me and my daughter today wasn't just about a bag. It was about the assumptions people make, about who belongs, about who is seen, and who is dismissed." The crowd grew still. Reporters held out microphones, but she wasn't speaking for the headlines. "I am the wife of this airline's CEO. Yes. But before that, I was a black woman flying with her child. And even if I were nobody's wife, even if I had no title or name you recognized, I would still deserve dignity. So does every person on every plane. No one should have to earn humanity." Owen stood beside her, not as a CEO, but as a husband, as a father, as a witness. "We're not here for retribution," he added. "We're here for accountability and growth." As they walked away from the cameras, Amira held Lena's hand tighter. "Mom," Lena whispered, "can I tell you something, anything? I'm glad that lady made fun of my bag." Amira stopped, confused. Why? Because if she didn't, you wouldn't have told the world what really matters. Tears filled Amira's eyes, out of the mouths of children. Clarity rises. Later that night, Amira sat alone in the hotel room. Owen was on a business call. Lena was asleep, curled up in bed with her toy plane. Amira pulled out her journal and began to write. Not a complaint, not a legal statement, but a letter. To the woman who mocked her daughter's bag, to the world that still hadn't learned. She wrote, "Dear stranger, you thought my daughter didn't belong, but she does, and one day, when she flies, she will sit in any seat she chooses, not because her parents are wealthy, not because she fought for it, but because by then, maybe, just maybe, the world will have finally caught up to her worth, and when that day comes, I hope you're flying too, and I hope you see her smile, because it means we've all risen." Amira closed the journal, turned off the light, and listened to the soft breath of her daughter sleeping. Above the clouds, justice had begun to descend, and somewhere deep inside the quiet, a storm had passed, a new sky waited. Sometimes justice doesn't shout. It doesn't storm down aisles or make headlines right away. Sometimes it walks in quietly, sits in row 4C, watches, waits, then rewrites the ending. What happened on that flight wasn't just about a girl and a bag. It was about what we choose to see, who we choose to stand up for, and what kind of silence we allow in spaces where voices go unheard. Tiana's pain was small, but it echoed, not because she fought back, but because someone finally did. Someone who didn't need to raise his voice to raise the truth. In a world still tangled in bias, this story reminds us that our presence matters, that compassion is power, and that the quietest people on the plane may carry the loudest truths. We hope this story left you feeling something, maybe anger, maybe love, maybe a hunger for better. If it did, let it stay with you. Let it change how you look at the person next to you, or the child struggling with their luggage. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be heard, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Because together, we're not just telling stories. We're telling truths that fly. See you in the next one.